Hi, welcome back, YouTube. Back again, backyard mechanic, one and only the one. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to change a wheel bearing, front wheel bearing, on a 2015 Nissan Versa. If you enjoy the contents that I put out and the demonstrations that I do, go ahead and like and subscribe and join my channel and push that bell for notifications when I put out new videos. First thing we're going to do is take this flathead screwdriver and pry off the hubcap. Next, we're going to take off the lug nuts using a 21 socket. Now, most people usually use a breaker bar, if that's what they have, and I would use it too. Since I have my impact out, I'm going to use my impact gun. Now, we line the jack it up, and place it on the jack stand. Next, you want to completely remove the lug nuts and remove the tire. We're going to set the lug nuts out the way, somewhere where we'll remember where they are, and they'll stay together. Next, we're going to remove the tires. We're going to slowly lower the jack. Since we got the tire off, we want to take off the caliper and the caliper bracket next. Before we do that, we want to relieve the pressure from the brakes by taking a flathead screwdriver, prying in between the rotor and the caliper, and just pushing back till you get a little space. Now that the bolts are out the way, we're going to sit the bolts out to the side to where we'll find them. Next, pull out the caliper, and hang it with a bungee. That way it'll have slack on the brake line. Now that we removed the caliper and hung it with a bungee, next, we want to remove the rotor by simply sliding it off. Now we remove the rotor. Next, we want to take off the axle nut by removing the cotter pin with a pair of pliers and a flathead screwdriver. Now that I'm ready to take off the axle nut, I'll spray a little WD-40 on it. And I'm going to spray WD-40 on the other nuts and bolts that I may have to remove. That way they'll already be soaked when it's time to come to them. In order to remove the axle nut bolt, you need a 30mm socket. And I'm gonna use my impact gun. We're gonna remove this bolt here to remove the lower control arm. This bolt has a nut on the other side, and they're both 14mm. So I'm gonna use a 14mm wrench with a 14mm socket to remove it. Now that we have the bolt out, we want to take a ball joint remover, and there's many different types. You don't have to necessarily just use this one, but this is the one I'm gonna use to remove the lower control arm. The control arm is loose. Next, we want to remove the speed control sensor, and that is a 10mm bolt. And we're going to use a 10mm socket with an extension. I removed the 10mm bolt and I just pull out the sensor. That's the control sensor, and you just want to hang it out the way. Next, we want to remove this nut from the outer tie rod end on the steering knuckle, and it's a 14mm. Before you remove the nut completely, make sure you leave it just barely there. Take your hammer and hit it. That way you won't damage the threads. You see it popped out? Then continue to remove the nut. Now that the outer tie rod is removed from the steering knuckle, next we want to remove these two bolts here. And usually I'll put the screw back in place. That way I know where they go and they're not lost. Now that I removed the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle, now I want to remove the two nuts here from the strut. And they are 21mm. The bolts are removed. Now I'm going to take a screwdriver and pry it in between here to separate the strut. Now that the strut's removed, we just want to separate the lower control arm and pull off the hub assembly. Now, being that I am a backyard mechanic, I have to take this to a shop and have them press out the old bearings and then press in the new bearings. We're here at Sons & Sons Services to get the bearings pressed in the hub, since I don't have a press at home. Now that we got the hub bearings replaced, we want to put everything in reverse. So first you want to take the hub and place it on this ball joint. Want to take the hub, put it back on the axle, Line it up. We'll take the hub, put the ball joint in, and line it up. Till it falls in place. Next, you're going to put the hub back into the struts and replace the bolts. Now that you have the bolt and nuts back in the strut, next you want to put the bolt in at the bottom for the ball joint. Now I got the nut and bolt in. Next, I want to put the outer tie rod in back into the steering knuckle. Now that I got the outer tie rod in back into the steering knuckle and the nut back on, now I'm going to tighten the bolts down snugly and then torque them to the right torque specs. So first we'll start with the strut bolts and tighten those down. Now that I got the bolts in and the nuts tightened, hand tightened, I want to take the torque wrench and tighten it using a 21mm socket. So then we're going to torque these bolts down to 120 foot-pounds. Now these bolts are torqued down to 120 foot-pounds using a torque wrench and a 21mm socket. Next we'll move on to the lower control arm and ball joint bolt and nut, and we want to tighten that up until it's just snug, and then we want to torque it. Now that we got the lower control arm and ball joint nut snugly tightened, we want to torque it down using a torque wrench to 21 foot-pounds, and we're going to use a 14mm socket on the torque wrench. So we take our torque wrench and we want to just tighten it until it torques down at 21 foot-pounds. Now that's torqued down, we want to move to the outer tie rod nut. And we want to tighten this down until it's snug. And then we want to torque it. Now that it's tightened down, let's take our torque wrench and a 14mm socket, and we're going to torque this down to 28 foot-pounds. Next, we want to replace the ABS sensor and reinstall it using a 10mm bolt. And we hand tighten it, and then when we tighten it down, because it's plastic, we just want to snug it just enough to snug it. Perfect. We place the line back into the strut. Next, you want to install the axle nut onto the axle. Then you want to tighten it up. Now that you tighten it snugly, you want to torque the axle nut to 180 foot-pounds using a 30mm socket. Now that we torqued the axle nut bolt down to 180 foot-pounds using a 30mm socket and a torque wrench, you want to reinstall the cotter pin. Now most of the time you want to replace these, but this one is still in good condition, so I'm going to reuse it. Now that you place it in, you want to take your pliers and bend them down. Now that you have your cotter pan reinstalled, you want to put on your rotor. Now that your rotor is on, you want to reinstall your brake caliper. Now that you have your brake caliper in place, you want to reinstall the bolt. Now that you have the bolts snug tightly, now you want to torque it down using a torque wrench at 62 foot-pounds, and you want to use a 17 millimeter with your torque wrench. Now that you have those torqued down to 62 foot-pounds using a 17 millimeter socket with a torque wrench, next you want to reinstall the tire. Now that we have the tire back on and the lug nuts snug, now we want to take our 21 millimeter socket and our torque wrench and torque them down to 82 foot-pounds. Now that we have our tire reinstalled, we got our lug nuts on and they're snugly tight. Now we want to torque it down to 82 foot-pounds using a torque wrench and a 21 millimeter socket, and you want to do it in a criss-cross pattern to make sure the tire goes on even. Now that I got the tire back on and the hubcap on, now we can raise it, take it off the jack stand and lower it. If you like this video and for more contents like this, like and subscribe and hit the notification buttons to be notified when new videos and contents are available. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, everyone, stay safe and be blessed. Backyard Mechanic. Until we meet again, I'll see you next time.